Ukraine?
In the partisan political sense. Not in the economic.
Not the debt.
I mean, a little bit the how do you pronounce it? How do you pronounce the I really
Don't want to say his name because he might shoot at you. Say that guy.
that guy. That's
Physically attacked the central bank last week. Somebody broke through the back doors.
but the privilege bonds have been like rocket fire this year.
Yep. It's one of the best performing currencies in the world right now, too. I think you take it out of context. I think 3 months. Pick 10 years.
Longer time where I was like, looked at that and thought, all right, I should pay a tad more attention.
The local bond market, she got, my colleague who's now the minister, she got them tradable on one of these markets. You can actually trade in Vivian bonds, which is make all the outside investors. It used to be limited to the local market, to non-convertible currency.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty high yield if you want to see the currency.
And, people have been making big losses in Argentina. The big one, there's like the Ukraine option for Argentina, which a lot of creditors are
What's
pushing.
the name?
20% face value haircut, push out maturities 5 to 10 years, which shockingly, many of the bondholders who have claims they are trading in the 40s think it'll be a wonderful deal.
The number of unknowns is so enormous. I could never have predicted what's going on right now with Ukraine and the United States. And how that might affect the negotiations with the Russians next Monday. Who knew? There's no way. Stop making noise.
I thought you were manipulating American politics for your position.
Yeah, definitely. It's me.
Close to the mic.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Brad Dean, the CEO of Discover Puerto Rico, the recently formed organization, non-governmental organization that leads tourism promotion for the island of Puerto Rico. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the fellow American citizens in Puerto Rico who today are writing an amazing comeback story in tourism. If this were a movie, we'd call it Rocky. If this were a baseball season, we'd call it the 68 Mets or maybe the 16 Chicago Cubs. But we're talking tourism today. And in Puerto Rico, it's an amazing comeback that's happening in the tourism industry today. Take a look at airport arrivals in the first 9 months of this year, already 4% above pre-Hurricane Maria levels. Every commercial airport in the island seeing increased traffic and record arrivals from North America. Thankfully, this is helping spur increased visitor activity measured by the number of room nights and independent rental nights that are being rented. You can see here a dramatic increase over 2018, but more importantly, the record level of activity over pre-Maria time. And the lodging revenue sector, which of course is incredibly important to the hospitality arena, we're seeing, again, record levels of revenue. Two indications here. One, that we're not having to discount. Hotel yields are actually at record levels, and this huge increase of independent rental product is actually allowing us to attract more visitors throughout the island. And the best news of all, it's not just leisure travel. We're finally, after 5 years of successive declines, seeing a turnaround in the meetings, convention, and incentive travel market. In fact, the highest level of meeting convention bookings in the last 5 years occurred in 2019. And as we look forward, Even better news. If we look 15 months ago at the future pipeline of meeting convention business coming to Puerto Rico and where that potential business is today, nearly a threefold increase representing almost $180 million of potential incremental business. All of this is great news, and no surprise to those who are familiar with Puerto Rico, not only a great leisure destination, but well positioned to become the premier business travel destination for the Caribbean, with the largest, most technologically advanced convention center in the Caribbean, hotel space, almost 1.3 million square feet of meeting space available, and most exciting to note, under construction today and set to open in the spring of 2020, El Distrito, a 5-acre hospitality entertainment district. It's like a slice of Times Square with a Latin feel and a Caribbean flavor. All of this underscores Puerto Rico as an island of opportunity, and we believe that tourism is the pathway forward for Puerto Rico. As we're seeing this record level of activity, it's a reinforcement that Puerto Rico is coming back bigger, better, and faster in tourism than anyone would have thought. And for those in the investment sector, even better news. Our sister organization, Invest Puerto Rico, is now getting up to speed, and they're ready, willing, and eager to assist potential investors in Puerto Rico to turn this into a goldmine of an opportunity for you. So whether you come to Puerto Rico for a conference, convention, a meeting, an investment tour, or just a great vacation getaway, this is what you can expect to see.
Okay, thanks for that presentation. I'm Andrew Scurria with the Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure we would all much rather be in Puerto Rico with the weather the way it is today, rather than slogging through the mud. But this being a distressed investment conference, we're here to discuss the current state of the restructuring of Puerto Rico's debt obligations, which I know is of a lot of importance to everyone in the room, not just because of the quantum of debt at issue, which is orders of magnitude bigger than most of the corporate restructurings that we're all used to dealing with, but for its precedential effect on future municipal workouts. So for purposes of our discussion today, we're going to mostly focus on the central government, since that's where the bulk of the claims lie. So I'll just start out by asking the panelists to each give a brief introduction of themselves and tell us which stakeholder they're representing in the proceedings and what hat they're wearing.
All right, I guess I'll start. My name is Sean Gumbs. I'm a senior managing director at FTI Consulting, and we serve as financial advisor to the official committee of retirees of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. We usually just call it the Retiree Committee. So the Retiree Committee represents three of the Commonwealth's main pension systems. There's the Employees Retirement System, ERS, the Teachers Retirement System, TRS, and the Judges Retirement System, JRS. And across those three, think about roughly 167,000 or so retirees. I just wanted to spend 1 minute or so just giving a little bit of a background on who the retirees are. I've spoken on panels like this, as you might imagine, quite a bit over the last couple of years. So just want to get a couple of things across, and if there's one thing that you take away from today is the notion that the pension benefits on the island of Puerto Rico are modest, and really frankly modest by any measure. And let me just give you a couple of quick numbers on that. $821 a month is the median pension benefit, so that's $9,800 or so a year. The average pension benefit is a little higher than that. It's about $13,800, compared to the mainland, by the way, of about $27,000, so just a little more than half of what retirees on the mainland get. 70 years old, and for folks who might think, well, you know, those numbers that you gave are sort of not representative of the extremes of the curve, just let me give another couple numbers. 85% of retirees have monthly pension benefits less than $2,000. So, you know, I always say this is not what people typically think of when they think of municipal pensions that they might have been exposed to stateside, like where, for example, someone started at a job in New York at 21, retired after 20 years on the job at 41, and then went across the street and got another city job and retired at 61 with 2 pensions. That could not be further from what it is in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. My name is Natalie Jaresco, and I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. The board was created under Promesa, a law passed by the U.S. Congress in 2016, specifically to respond to an unmanageable debt burden of about $72 billion, as well as $55 billion in underfunded pension liabilities. The mandate set out for the board in the law is simple: to achieve fiscal responsibility and access to the capital markets. But accomplishing that mandate is not simple. It requires, at a bare minimum, restructuring this debt, right-sizing the government while producing more efficient government services, and spurring, to the extent possible, structural reforms to make a more competitive island economy that will grow and provide the jobs necessary to battle the natural trends on the island. Thank you.
My name is Matt Rodrigue. I'm a managing director with Miller Buckfire & Co. I advise a group that owns $1.6 billion approximately of early vintage general obligation and public building authority debt issued by Puerto Rico. The group is called the Lawful Constitutional Debt Coalition, and the group's objective, among other things, is to search for a consensual resolution to the debt restructuring of Puerto Rico. We are parties to the restructuring support agreement that was announced on June 16th of this year, and some members of the group were also members of a prior group known as the Senior COFINA Ad Hoc Bondholders. I advised that group for several years through the successful restructuring of the COFINA credit in February of this year. I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
I'm Brad Setzer. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I have no advisory or financial stake in Puerto Rico. I have an intellectual stake. I was certainly part of the team at the U.S. Treasury that evaluated Puerto Rico's finances back in 2015 and concluded that the only path to restore Puerto Rico to financial health involved a law like Promesa that would facilitate an orderly restructuring of, to use the famous words of the former governor, an unpayable level of debt.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So for those that may not be read in, I think it'd be useful for us to just give a bit of background on sort of where we are. You know, the treatment of some of the debt claims against the central government of Puerto Rico backed by sales taxes is already been taken care of pursuant to a plan of adjustment that was confirmed in February that covered, I think, $18 billion of sales tax debt. But the rest of the central government stack is going to be treated under a plan of adjustment that's still moving through the court system and hasn't been approved yet. Natalie, could you just, as an architect of that plan, could you just give us a broad overview of how it purports to treat debt claims against the central government, geo claims, what it aims to accomplish in terms of reprofiling Puerto Rico's debt?
Sure. Just to go back, I mean, if the total debt stack is in the 72 to 74 billion, depending on what you're accruing, as Andrew said, 18 of it has been dealt with in the COFINA restructuring. Another 8 billion or so has been dealt with in the GDB, or government development bank restructuring. 9 billion of it is PREPA, or the electricity utility, which is not what we're talking about. PROSA has another 3.5 billion that's been reprofiled. So the piece that we're talking about today, which is described in the plan of adjustment that the Oversight Board filed, is $35 billion of claims. $35 billion of claims, which includes the general obligation bonds, or GOs. It includes clawbacks, meaning claims of other entities that have a clawback claim against the Commonwealth, as well as unsecured claims, as well as PBA claims against, and ERS claims against the Commonwealth. There is, in addition to that $35 billion that we're dealing with in this plan of adjustment, $50 billion in pension claims, retirees who have a claim to pensions that are not fundable because the retirement system, ERS in particular, is funded at zero. So what does this plan do? It takes that $35 billion of claims and it reduces it to $12 billion. It reduces the total amount, and it ensures that there is a sustainable level of government debt service for the next 30 years, taking into account COFINA. So taking into account COFINA, which was separate and done already, it basically establishes that the government cannot spend more than about 9%, under 10% of its government revenue for debt service, both COFINA and Commonwealth, in any given year. That compares to about 28% contractually pre-restructuring. It also creates a mechanism to settle the different claims that against challenged bonds. You will talk probably later, but several of the issuances of general obligation bonds has been challenged in the court, and rather than rely on litigation coming to an end, it provides for a settlement mechanism which could make this more efficient. It also establishes a debt management policy for Puerto Rico. So one thing for us to restructure this today and to do it in a sustainable way, but it's quite another to ensure that this doesn't happen again in Puerto Rico. So there is a debt management policy in the proposed plan of adjustment that looks back at the practices of the past that led Puerto Rico to this situation, and basically establishes rules and policies where it can't happen again. In addition to dealing with that $35 billion in claims, this agreement brings together the compromises of multiple stakeholders, not only debt holders, represented here by Matt, but also the retirees and also active employees, the unions in government. So what does it do for the retirees? Well, no one likes a pension cut, and certainly it's not something that is easy for the retirees of Puerto Rico to manage. However, we do have to recognize what the rules of the game are in bankruptcy court, and they are unsecured creditors. So we have reached an agreement with the Corps where they take a reduction, a slight reduction that does not affect 74% of future and current retirees, in return for the benefit of predictability, stability of their payments going forward in a pension trust, as well as a potential restoration clause. Well, why would unions sign on? Why did the unions come forward and support this agreement? They came forward because we offered them, again, stability and predictability in the form of a new collective bargaining agreement, slightly increased health care benefits, in return for them respecting and working with us to achieve the right sizing that I mentioned to you is so critical to having this fiscal plan implemented. It also, in that union agreement, restores a pension system where employee contributions to that system disappeared. And so $1.3 billion in this plan of adjustment goes towards restoring that. So in essence, this plan of adjustment is a set of compromises. It's the best possible agreement from our perspective under the circumstances that brings together different stakeholders, retirees, active credit bondholders, and puts a sustainable level of debt and a debt policy looking forward into place for Puerto Rico.
So I know a central feature of the plan is that it treats some general obligation bond claims differently from others, as well as has different treatment for PBA claims, which are tantamount to GOs, and that's because of when the bonds were issued, and that gave rise to some questions about where they should rank in priority. Matt, I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit more as a representative of one of the creditor groups that's sort of caught up in that debate.
Sure. So, like any complicated capital structure, bonds that Puerto Rico has issued have different rights and remedies, and they also have different risks. Natalie made reference to the fact that some of the bonds have been challenged, and there's a settlement embedded within the plan of adjustment that's been proposed. Broadly, the plan of adjustment proposes treatment for 3 different types of bonds. For GO bonds, there are early vintage bonds, which were issued prior to 2012. There are 2012 bonds and 2014 bonds. And the primary challenge relates to whether bonds were issued in excess of the debt limit. Puerto Rico has a debt limit embedded in its constitution, which says a couple of things. One is that, subject to one limited exception, general obligation debt cannot be issued with maturity of more than 30 years. It also says that the maximum future payment cannot exceed 15% of the average of the 2 prior years' revenue. And my group's view on this test is that PBA debt should be included because PBA receives almost all of its revenue from the Commonwealth, and the debt issued by the PBA is guaranteed by the Commonwealth. And when you do that, the debt issued post-2012 is in excess of the debt limit. There are other competing theories, I'm not going to go through them all, but they're out there, that say that debt as early as 2011 may be challenged. So basically, as you go further into the future, there's increasingly more risk to the bonds that were issued. And as a result, there's different settlement proposals embedded within the plan. So the baseline recovery in the plan is 64 cents, which is referred to as the baseline recovery. If all the GO debt were pari passu, all of the GO debt holders would be entitled to 64 cents. Because the 2012 and 2014 bonds have more risk successively, there's a settlement proposal embedded in the plan of 45 cents for the 2012 bonds and 35 cents for the 2014 bonds. That settlement is voluntary. It's up to the bondholders whether or not they elect to receive that treatment. If they don't elect for the settlement option, they're entitled to litigate for the pari passu treatment, which would be the 64 cents. Again, it's their option. Importantly, under the plan, that litigation can continue post-emergence from bankruptcy. So what the plan does is it sets up a legal structure that allows the Commonwealth to emerge from bankruptcy and allows litigation over the vintage of the issuance of bonds to continue post-emergence, which we believe is important for Puerto Rico. It's important for a host of reasons for Puerto Rico to have a path to exit from bankruptcy over the near to medium term. We think it will stimulate capital formation, allow the government to start to reinvest, so forth. And Natalie, I'm sure, could continue and discuss many of the reasons why it's important to emerge from bankruptcy. But the plan embeds this feature, which allows for emergence and also allows for bondholders who own the 2012 or 14 bonds to pursue their remedies for the pari passu 64% treatment if they so choose.
So Sean, I'll come back to you for a sec. You represent the largest single creditor class in this restructuring and probably the most economically vulnerable. You've given us a bit of a sense of who the pensioners are, what their economic picture looks like currently. So could you just drill down a little bit more on sort of what they're looking at under this plan and sort of how much pain they could feel, so to speak?
Sure. So, in order to do that best, let me just, and I'm happy to go through some of the specifics around the plan of adjustment and how it impacts the retirees. I won't go through all the details of it, but in order to really best do it, I think I should start with what the original Oversight Board's proposal was in the various fiscal plans, and frankly, I guess it's still technically in the May 9th fiscal plan, which is that retirees were subject to cuts of up to 25%, and those who were protected from cuts was about 25% of the population. And so fast forward to where we are today, The committee, the retiree committee, was successful in our discussions and negotiations with the Oversight Board, and we now have an agreement in which 61.2%, or about 102,000 retirees, will not get cuts at all. And of those folks, the remaining 39% or so, which is around 65,000 folks that are subject to cuts, will face cuts up to a maximum of 8.5%. So that's down from what they were potentially exposed to of up to 25%. There are a lot of other specifics around the plan that I won't get into, but there's really two other big things that I think it's worth talking about. One is, as part of the plan, we also have a pension reserve fund, which is going to be created pursuant to the plan of adjustment. It will be in a trust that is managed separately from the Commonwealth government. It'll be managed professionally, and it will be a fund that is available to generate conservative investment returns and then be available down the road, literally, when the Commonwealth begins to run fiscal deficits. So in the current plan, that's roughly 2038 or so. And there's a series of criteria that the Commonwealth will have to meet in order to be able to access those funds. But the notion is those dollars will be available purely for the payment of pensions when the Commonwealth begins to run fiscal deficits. And in terms of the dollars, it's going to be funded with near-term surpluses. So specifically from fiscal 2020 to fiscal 2027, assuming that actuals come in as forecast, we expect some $5.8 billion will be put into the reserve to then grow to be available for the payment of pensions down the road.
Thanks. So one thing I've thought about a lot is sort of what investors have viewed as, Puerto Rico's potential. In other words, what were their expectations about what they would recover in this restructuring? How much debt did they think that Puerto Rico could sustain long term, given its declining demographics, declining tax base, companies leaving, fertility rates aren't where they should be, and obviously those expectations sort of were what they were before Promesa. The law was passed. We had a hurricane that sort of scrambled all that, and also the government's true finances have kind of come into focus over time. So I'm wondering what the panel thinks about whether investors kind of got it right, and to what extent they might have gotten it wrong in terms of just how much debt this government could support, and where investors would come out in the end.
Who wants to go first? Brett?
I'll take a stab. I think investors mostly have gotten it right. The GOs, broadly speaking, if you go back and look at the vintage GOs, have been trading at around 60 cents on the dollar since about 2014. So I think the GOs in general, at least the vintage GO holders, perhaps the restructuring was designed around that price, but the GOs essentially got what the market expected. The COFINA seniors always had, at least in my personal view, the strongest claim. They were clearly, if the constitutional questions around COFINA were to be addressed, they were the senior holders of a secured claim. And the COFINA structure was over-collateralized. I think the COFINA structure was, I'll be careful, a bloody disaster. It subordinated everyone else. It caused a significant part of the losses on the more junior claims. But the COFINA seniors had a solid claim, and that claim actually got strengthened when Puerto Rico was brought into a bankruptcy-like process modeled on Chapter 9, because Chapter 9 protects secured claims. The COFINA juniors, the COFINA juniors sold off way too far after Maria, and those creditors who bought into the COFINA juniors at the peak of Puerto Rico's distress have done very well. Personally, I think the settlement on the juniors was a bit too rich, but that's my personal view. And then I think the other claims were generally recognized as junior claims from the beginning, with the exception of a few people who had rather extravagant legal theories about how they could collect on certain subcategories of bonds. So in general, I think the recoveries have matched expectations, but I will editorialize slightly. The restructuring will leave Puerto Rico with around $25 billion of debt. $2 billion of that doesn't pay current interest. It's the capital appreciation bonds on COFINA. But $20 billion is actually a relatively large number by comparison to the various states. The closest state comparator would be Mississippi. Mississippi has roughly the same population, 3 million people. Mississippi has an economy that's a little bit less than twice as large as Puerto Rico. Call it 120 billion versus 70 billion for Puerto Rico. Mississippi has a little over 5 billion of debt and a little over 500 million in annual debt service. Mississippi is the poorest state, obviously. Mississippi is not viewed as the most indebted state by any measure, but it is not the least indebted state by any measure. It's above average, so to speak. And so by comparison, Puerto Rico, with an economy that's a half to 2/3 of the size, will have roughly 4 times as much debt and roughly 2 to 3 times as much annual debt service. So Puerto Rico is going to emerge with a debt stock that puts it towards the upper end of the distribution of states when looked at as a share of its own revenue, and at the top end when looked at debt per capita. So we're not talking about a restructuring, despite the various haircuts, that leaves Puerto Rico with an unambiguously clear path to debt sustainability.
Yeah, do you think it's difficult to say what the proper debt levels should be post-restructuring, given that Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income taxes, and that makes it a bit, difficult to do comparisons to the U.S. states? How do you kind of think about that?
I think that's a red herring, to be honest.
Yeah, why is that?
The median family income in Puerto Rico is $20,000. An American, Puerto Ricans are also Americans, but an American resident in the 50 states who makes around $20,000 doesn't actually pay federal income tax either. An American family resident in the United States would receive money typically back from the federal government if they have children through the Earned Income Tax Credit. So there is no plausible way a population that on average, and there's a huge range, but the median income of around 20,000 can generate substantial amounts of income tax revenue.
Yeah, and the reason I asked about investors' expectations was, it does seem like at certain points they perhaps have miscalculated somewhat. Notably, investors bought $3.5 billion in GOs in 2014, and Puerto Rico defaulted about 2 years later. And the ratings agencies had Puerto Rico reasonably highly rated until pretty recently. I don't know. Did they just not foresee that the U.S. Congress would get involved and open up a path for the debt to be restructured through a bankruptcy process, or what do you think accounts for that?
I will give a real quick answer, and then I'll let others chime in. But I would encourage anyone who is not to read the risk factors in the 2014 GO. And I would note that one of the risk factors explicitly mentioned was the possibility that the federal government might pass a law that allowed the restructuring of Puerto Rico's debt.
So I'm going to jump in quickly. I promised to answer your question, and then I'm going to take us back to your previous question. I would agree. You talked about ratings of bonds. I mean, my recollection was, starting in 2012, 13, most of the credits, whether it was GO credits or PBA credits or HTA credits, were starting to either be at the lower rung of investment grade or they were at the top rungs of spec grade. So I think I'd be hard pressed to say investors weren't fully aware of the risks that Puerto Rico was facing. So that's the answer to that question. Now I'm going to go back to the other question, which I think is going to be a different take a little bit on what folks got wrong. it will surprise a lot of people in this room, I think, that, and it's not a matter of getting it right or wrong, but there are plenty of people, and I know Natalie's met with plenty of them, on the island who think that pensions shouldn't be cut at all, right? And think about that for lots of reasons, not the least of which social and economic reasons, that because of the low median incomes, the low median pension income that I talked about, the $9,800, and frankly, most of us have watches that are worth more than $9,800, right? So, or at least I do anyway. It's very difficult for folks to stomach at the end of the day getting cut further when they've experienced cuts, pretty meaningful cuts in the not so distant past. And so we'll get into that a little bit more, but it's not clear to me, let me say it differently, it is clear to me that there's a lot of people on the island who frankly think that 8.5% is way too much.
So, Andrew, going back to your earlier question about whether or not purchasers of bonds, the 2012 and 2014 issuance, saw this coming, I take the point on the risk factors. I think there was increasing concern over the credit quality of Puerto Rico at that time. In late 2013, the New York Times actually did a piece highlighting that issue. And if you look at the 2014 issuance, the bondholders actually demanded 9% tax-exempt yield to place those bonds, which is an exceptionally high yield in the municipal market context, virtually unheard of for the interest rate environment today. And with respect to your earlier question, I think the situation has played out differently than how some bondholders expected. One of the features that was frequently touted by 2014 bondholders originally was the fact that they were subject to New York law. That wound up being basically not effective or not meaningful when Congress passed the Promesa law, because Promesa effectively trumped the New York law. So there have been differences as the process has evolved and played out. While I agree with much of what Brad said earlier, I do take issue with the difference in terms of debt capacity analysis. Puerto Rico certainly is an impoverished area, an impoverished state. You point to the median income. I don't dispute those facts. But Puerto Rico also has a very high Gini coefficient, and there would be some very wealthy taxpayers who would pay federal income tax if Puerto Rico were a state. And if Puerto Rico has an effective tax policy, it should be able to generate revenues from those higher income earners, and that could be used to support debt. Nonetheless, the LCDC, the group that I represent, has entered into a plan support agreement to support the plan that the Commonwealth has filed and support the recoveries that I spoke to earlier, notably the 64% pari passu recovery. And we think that overall it gets to an appropriate debt level for Puerto Rico. And we think that a consensual resolution of the debt is much more valuable to Puerto Rico than additional years spent in litigation fighting over these issues.
Yeah,
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Just to kind of close up, in the end, the expectations are from one end of the spectrum to the other. You will find parties on the island who believe that all the debt should be wiped out, period. And you will find on the other end of the spectrum creditors who believe that they should receive 100% repayment. A contract is a contract. And what this plan of adjustment is a series of compromises, because neither of those two extremes can actually be implemented, especially in the bankruptcy procedures that we have been put into in Promesa. Similarly, this isn't a state from the pure comparison to indebted states. We have, for example, substantially less municipal debt in Puerto Rico than, let's say, the state of Illinois would have, with Chicago issuing a massive amount of debt. So the comparison isn't perfect. And yet the comparison to a sovereign is not perfect, because Puerto Rico doesn't have the access to third-party funds like the IMF or the EBRD or some other international financial institution. So in every case when we're working with Puerto Rico, it's more complex than anything we've seen before, that anyone's done before. It's more complex than Detroit or Stockton or even Venezuela. It's complex, and it's also living this bankruptcy process is going through a series of tests that the law requires us to go through that requires compromise without meeting either of those extremes. And so I guess in the end, if you're seeking consensual agreement, which the board really believed is the best possible outcome, the least costly outcome for Puerto Rico, if we were seeking consensual agreement, there had to be compromises. And I think the value of this plan of adjustment is that it wasn't a compromise reached solely with a group of creditors, but it was also with the people on the island who also shared that view that getting out of bankruptcy sooner rather than later with some compromise was more valuable than fighting for a decade.
Yeah, so just a couple more minutes here, but I know that a lot has been said about Puerto Rico's past borrowing practices. I know the board commissioned a pretty extensive report that was highly critical of the way that the government borrowed in the past to cover operating deficits and selling debt that arguably didn't comply with constitutional limits. At the same time, Natalie, I know you've said that you want this to be sort of a one and done restructuring, right? That where we don't find ourselves back where we were 20 years from now, especially in an environment of declining demographics. And I understand you mentioned earlier that the plan has a new debt management policy that aims to prevent that from happening. Could you just go over what the essential elements of that are?
Sure. Anyone who would like to could take a look at the Cobra and Kim forensic report that we had done on the debt, where they looked at all the issuances and what challenges and what practices, what policies or what lack of policies brought us to this point. And the takeaways are reflected in that debt management policy, which is a part and parcel of the proposed plan of adjustment, which we hope will be confirmed by a court and therefore will be at a federally confirmed level of policy to be implemented in Puerto Rico going forward. Number one, Puerto Rico would not be able to borrow any longer to cover operating expenses, to cover budget deficits. It would only be allowed to borrow for capital expenditures, in essence, things that create economic growth and are worth investing that borrowed capital into. That was a major issue. It allowed constant unbalanced budgets and deficits to be covered with increased borrowing. Second, it would not allow for debt to be taken on to retire old debt unless there was a cash flow savings attached to it. In other words, you can't borrow to retire debt in a more expensive borrowing than what you currently have. Again, a practice that Puerto Rico has used over the past years that caused part of this. And lastly, that new debt can be no longer than 30 years in term and has to start amortizing within 2 years. And so there are a set of these debt management policies, one that still needs to be fully developed but is partly in there, which is that there is a cap to annual debt service. Right now, we've used something called the MADS cap, or a maximum annual debt service, based on the 10 least indebted states and what the average of the 10 most indebted states, what the 10 most indebted states pay as a percentage of their annual revenues, and that's just under 10%. And so we will put a cap into this policy as well that we will agree with the Commonwealth so that new borrowings don't outweigh the sustainability of what we've agreed on to date.
And what impact, or how should we think about the current sort of market environment for high-yielding municipal debt? And I ask because it seems to be in very, very high demand, and I would argue that really helped the COFINA plan of adjustment get through because it helped make the deal make economic sense for the supporting creditors. Matt, do you foresee something similar happening when the central government plan is eventually confirmed? And just how should we think about the impact of market dynamics on this restructuring?
Yeah. So 2019 has been a remarkable year, in fact, in the municipal market broadly. And yields are at all-time lows, driven primarily by two factors. One is there's been a dearth of issuance. The U.S. economy is going on all cylinders, and right now municipalities across the U.S. are issuing less debt than they have in prior years on virtually any metric, any way that you measure it. This means that there are fewer bonds coming to market for investors to purchase. The other thing that has happened at the same time is the yield curve has gone down. If we were sitting here a year ago, we would have all expected interest rates to continue rising. Of course, the Federal Reserve raised rates for the last time in December of 2018. This year, they've done an about face, and interest rates have started coming down, and they've come down across the curve, not just the front end. So this has created this environment where there's virtually insatiable demand, both for high-grade municipal debt and also for high-yield municipal debt. And I think it's an opportunity for Puerto Rico if it can strike consensual deals with its creditors now in this interest rate environment. I think creditors are more willing to play ball because they place more value on future cash flows. And I think it also sets up Puerto Rico to reaccess capital markets once it emerges from bankruptcy. So there's really an opportunity given both the dynamics in the municipal market and also with the interest rate curve where it stands today.
Yeah, and for anyone who wants to take this, what's your impression of what kind of macroeconomic indicators we're seeing out of Puerto Rico currently, given that we're sort of past the initial point where federal stimulus from hurricane relief, seems to be behind us, and we're settling into a long period of, of where economic growth is going to be, dependent on federal transfers that may or may not come, and there seems to be sort of a sluggishness as we sort of wait for clarity on whether the projections in the fiscal plan will get met. So what would you tell the audience about sort of the state of Puerto Rico's economy currently and how you, view your outlook?
So I think we had an absolute high in growth for the recent past in the year in which the hurricane hit, and we started to receive recovery funds. So for fiscal year 18, we were at 3.5% growth. Fiscal year is July 1st to June 30th. Fiscal year 19 appears, the official numbers aren't out, but it appears to be about half, I'm sorry, that's fiscal year 19. Put my glasses on. Fiscal year 19, the year after Maria hit and the year when we started to receive those FEMA funds. The federal government dollars are very, very important fiscal stimulus in this economy. And this year, it's already looking, the next year, fiscal year 20, is looking like about half of that growth, 1.5%. And that's because, as you mentioned, that recovery money has basically ended, what they call categories A and B for FEMA, the emergency money, whereas the reconstruction monies haven't really started to come in any meaningful fashion. I think $18.5 million was announced yesterday of what's expected to be tens of billions over time. So I think what we're seeing right now is a slowdown, stabilization, let's call it. You're seeing car vehicle sales stabilize year on year. You're seeing employment numbers stable but not growing any further. And so hopefully this is only a stabilization before the reconstruction money comes in. But reconstruction money is a long-term play. And so you can't predict how much will come in any particular year with any grain of accuracy today. In Katrina in New Orleans, it was a 15-year or more reconstruction process. So this is not going to be a one-year reconstruction. It is, the damage is extraordinary, and it's going to be 15 years minimum. So what we would look forward to is that we take this urgent period of time where we're receiving a fiscal stimulus and do structural reforms to change the competitive nature of the economy on our own. So as not to be completely reliant on federal stimulus going forward. Once that starts to peter out somewhere in the mid-20s, late 20s, instead we start to see a competitive economy flourishing because of Puerto Rico's innate competitive strengths, whether it be a growing tourism market, as earlier discussed, or whether it's better, more compliant tax collections, or whether it's a better ease of doing business environment that attracts new investors to the economy.
Yeah, Brad, do you have anything you want to add to that as our resident economist?
Well, I think Natalie did a pretty good job of describing the situation. I think the high-frequency indicators suggest that Puerto Rico's economy right now is completely stalled. Jobs growth is flat, maybe slightly negative. Year-over-year sales tax receipts are down. The economic activity indicator looks like it has stabilized at a level slightly below the pre-Maria levels, and about 10% below where it was in 2012. And we know that going forward, Puerto Rico faces a series of predictable shocks. One is the eventual exhaustion. It's going to be delayed, maybe 5-10 years from now, of the federal relief money. And absent additional legislation, a reduction in the federal support Puerto Rico receives. And then the other is that Puerto Rico's tax status, particularly on the corporate side, is ultimately unsustainable over time. And Puerto Rico actually outperforms the state comparators on revenue, largely because of the revenue it currently is able to extract from the offshore, because Puerto Rico is not onshore for corporate tax reasons, pharmaceutical sector. So there's a set of predictable shocks that Puerto Rico will have to overcome. And I think the Oversight Board, some of the creditors should be commended for having a debt service path that is very flat over time and thus recognizes the long-run challenges Puerto Rico faces.
I would say we're much more optimistic than Brad's outlook on Puerto Rico. I agree with Natalie that there needs to be vibrancy in the private sector in Puerto Rico. Ultimately, that's what's going to drive any recovery. The data points that Brad points to, though, sort of the flat sales and use tax collections, are only for the last 1 or 2 months, and I don't think you can draw trends from them yet. Also, as Natalie made reference to, the vast majority of the reconstruction money has yet to come into Puerto Rico, and it's going to be a multi-year, multi-decade project of reconstruction, and so it creates a window to facilitate that transformation of the private sector.
Well, and I would just add, I mean, I think folks on the island have been using a word that is quite a good word lately, pragmatic, right? And just focused on getting out of the Title III, and that frankly, uniting more around that and getting the economy, free of the shackles, if you will, of the Title III, actually could yield perhaps monies from the federal government start to flow a little better. I mean, there are multiple ways that getting the Title III behind us or behind the Puerto Rican economy, I think, can pay pretty significant dividends.
Yeah, I mean, just getting the legal fees done away with, I think, would be a huge lift, as restructuring has been full employment for the bankruptcy bar. I think that's all the time we have. Are we going to open it up for questions? One, maybe? Hands.
Hi, my question was with regard to the Highway and Transportation Authority special revenue bonds and the recent decision regarding the state of those in bankruptcy, and that I believe they're permitted to be paid, but they're now not required to be paid by the revenues that they have liens on. What do you think about the ramifications of that? Both positive and negative, and anything you've been hearing? I think Assured Guarantee is appealing it to the Supreme Court. Just any thoughts on that?
You're going to have to pull apart the question. I don't know of a recent decision that you're referring to on HTA.
The special revenues ruling, I believe, right?
Last week.
The First Court of Appeals that upheld the decision that they're permitted to pay the special revenues forward during bankruptcy, but they're not required to, which was, I guess, against the expectations of the municipal bond market.
Yeah, I prefer actually not to comment on it at this point because we're still kind of reviewing it and deciding what to do next. HTA is in Title III, and HTA is part of what is not on the list of yet done, and so there's a lot of ongoing discussions, and that's part of what we'll take into account, but I can't give you any direct response to it.
Thank you.
Much of the conversation has been geared around debt servicing and workout plans. And one thing that hasn't been referenced as of yet is the Opportunity Zone legislation. 98%, 97% of Puerto Rico has been listed as an Opportunity Zone. Curious as to how those capital flows are being factored into the outlook that each of you have put together for today.
So I think the Opportunity Zone designation is a huge opportunity for Puerto Rico. I think it actually highlights one of the issues we've discussed today, which is the importance of Puerto Rico having a path to emerge from bankruptcy. When you look at Puerto Rico over the last 5 to 6 years, there's been virtually no incremental capital formation on the island. And one of the things that you need to have a vibrant private sector and also to have investment is to have private capital formation. If you look at the commercial loan books of Popular, Santander, First Bank, the major banks on the island, they have not grown, they've declined. And so part of getting out of bankruptcy for the central government and reaccessing capital markets will mean that the cost of central government debt will not crowd out private investment opportunities like it has. If your central government debt yields 9% tax exempt or more, it's going to be very difficult for private capital to flow into the island to private projects. It's something that's beleaguered Puerto Rico on top of all the other challenges. And I think it's one of the important things that needs to be addressed, will be addressed as part of the restructuring. The other thing that I'm sure Natalie could talk about in more detail is reforms in the private sector itself, both the ease of doing business, labor, and so forth. And I think as Puerto Rico addresses barriers to doing business on island, it's going to make investors more willing to come in and invest and fund private projects that'll take advantage of the Opportunity Zone law.
So I'll just say, we welcome the fact that 98% of the island is covered by the special opportunity zone legislation, and the local legislature has passed its own version of kind of matching and necessary elements to attract investment. However, time is of the essence, because that special opportunity zone legislation is basically a capital gains play, and so people want to invest early in the process to be able to maximize their capital gains benefit. So right now what's critical is for Puerto Rico to have ready investment proposals for investors to invest in. And that is something that you hear investor after investor coming forward and saying, where are the investment proposals? What's ready for me to invest today? Because if I can't invest today, I'm going to go to Kentucky or Georgia or wherever the next place is. So critical right now, I think the legislative part is all set up for taking advantage. What really needs to happen is Puerto Rican investment proposals have to come forward in a big way to meet the potential of those investors. Separately from that, again, I'll just underline what Matthew said. Tax advantages are not the only reason investors invest in a certain place. You also have to have competitiveness in many other areas, whether it's permitting, registration of property, the administrative burden of the tax system, and these are areas where Puerto Rico does not rank as competitive with its near neighbors or the mainland, and areas where in the fiscal plan, you'll see, we really are pressing the government to move forward on those so that they don't have to rely solely on tax advantages and tax incentives to be competitive, that there's more to it than that.
Okay, I think that's it. If you could join me in giving a round of applause to the panelists.
You're the resident optimist.